The scream that echoed through the canyon was faint but unmistakable, and Benjamin Zeller froze mid-step on the narrow mountain trail, every muscle in his powerful frame tensing as he strained to hear it again. He had been tracking a deer for the better part of the morning through the rugged terrain outside Pinon, New Mexico. But the animal was forgotten the moment that desperate cry reached his ears. Living alone in these mountains for the past 5 years had sharpened his senses beyond what most men possessed, and he knew the sound of genuine terror when he heard it. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the rocky landscape, the heat creating shimmering waves in the distance. Benjamin shaded his eyes with one calloused hand and scanned the ridgeline to the east, his long dark hair catching in the hot wind that swept through the canyon. At 28 years old, he stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk and arms corded with muscle from years of survival in this unforgiving wilderness. His sun-bronzed skin stretched over a chest and abdomen that showed the definition of someone who worked hard for every meal, every shelter, every moment of existence in these mountains. Another scream pierced the air, closer this time, and Benjamin broke into a run. His buckskin boots pounded against the rocky ground as he navigated the treacherous terrain with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat. The sound had come from the old mining trail, a path that had been abandoned 3 years ago after the silver vein ran dry. Few people ventured that way anymore, which made the presence of someone in distress all the more concerning. As he rounded a sharp bend in the trail, his keen eyes immediately spotted the problem. A massive rockslide had torn down the mountainside, leaving a debris field of boulders and loose stone that completely blocked the narrow path. But it was not just a slide, it was an active trap. Wedged between 2 enormous rocks, he could see a flash of blue fabric and the pale fingers of a hand reaching desperately through a gap in the stone. "Help, please, someone help me." The voice was female, strained with pain and fear. Benjamin did not waste time with unnecessary questions. He sized up the situation with the practiced eye of someone who understood the mountain's dangers intimately. The woman was trapped between 2 massive boulders, each easily weighing several hundred pounds. Smaller rocks had piled around and on top of the larger ones, creating a precarious prison. One wrong move and the entire structure could shift, crushing her completely. "I am here," he called out, his deep voice steady and calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Do not move. I am going to get you out. Hurry, please, I cannot breathe properly. The rocks are pressing on my chest." Benjamin assessed the pile from multiple angles, his mind working through the problem like a puzzle. The 2 main boulders were the key. If he could shift the one on the left, it might create enough space to pull her free. But the weight was immense, far more than any normal man could hope to move. He had never been a normal man. Setting his rifle carefully aside, Benjamin approached the boulder on the left. He planted his feet wide, finding solid purchase on the rocky ground. His hands gripped the rough surface of the stone, fingers finding holds in the natural grooves. He could feel the heat of the sun-baked rock against his palms. Taking a deep breath, he engaged every muscle in his body, his shoulders bunching, his back straightening, his legs driving upward with all the force he could muster. The boulder groaned but did not budge. "What is your name?" he asked, partly to keep her conscious and alert, partly to focus his own mind. Margaret Dalton." Her voice was growing weaker. "Margaret, I am Benjamin. I am going to move this rock. It is going to make noise and other stones might shift. Do not be afraid." He repositioned himself, this time getting lower, using his legs more than his back. The muscles in his thighs bulged as he drove upward again, the tendons in his neck standing out like cords. A vein pulsed at his temple. His entire body shook with the effort, every fiber of his being committed to the impossible task before him. The boulder shifted. Just an inch, but it moved. Encouraged, Benjamin adjusted his grip and heaved again. This time the rock rolled several inches to the left, and he heard Margaret gasp as some of the pressure released. But it was not enough. She was still trapped. He moved to the second boulder, the one pinning her from the right. This one was even larger, its weight distributed across a wider base. Benjamin circled it, looking for any advantage, any weakness in how it sat. He found a spot where the ground beneath had a slight depression. If he could lift from this angle and roll it backward, it might work. Wedging his shoulder beneath an overhang of the rock, Benjamin planted his feet and pushed upward with his legs while simultaneously pulling with his arms. The position was awkward, forcing him to use muscles that were already screaming from the first attempt. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, but he did not relent. He thought of his own sister, lost to him these many years, and channeled that old pain into raw strength. The boulder resisted, seeming to mock his efforts. Then, with a grinding sound that echoed through the canyon, it moved. Not much, but enough. Benjamin kept the pressure on, his vision starting to tunnel from the exertion. The rock rolled back inch by agonizing inch, until finally there was a gap large enough for a person to slip through. He released the boulder and immediately dove toward Margaret, grabbing her under the arms and pulling her free just as several smaller rocks tumbled down to fill the space where she had been trapped. He carried her several yards away from the slide before gently lowering her to the ground, his chest heaving as he finally allowed himself to breathe. Margaret Dalton looked up at him with eyes the color of spring leaves, wide with shock and pain, but also profound relief. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with chestnut hair that had come loose from its pins and now tumbled around her shoulders in disarray. Her traveling dress was torn and covered in dust, and angry bruises were already forming on her exposed skin. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. "You moved them," she whispered, staring at him as if he were some kind of myth made flesh. "You moved boulders with your bare hands. Are you hurt? Can you move your legs?" Benjamin asked, his practical nature asserting itself over any desire to explain or justify what he had done. Margaret attempted to sit up, then winced and clutched at her ribs. "My side hurts terribly, and my ankle, I think it might be broken or badly twisted." Benjamin gently examined her ankle, his large hands surprisingly careful as they probed the swelling joint. "Sprained, I think, not broken. But it will need to be wrapped and elevated. Your ribs may be bruised or cracked. You need proper medical attention." "The nearest doctor is in Pinyon," Margaret said, then looked around as if only now realizing how remote their location was. "I was traveling with a guide, taking the scenic route to see the old mining operations. Our horses spooked at something, a snake, I think, and bolted. Mr. Henderson went after them, told me to wait by the rocks. That was when the slide started. I barely had time to react before I was trapped." Benjamin frowned, scanning the surrounding area. "How long ago was this? Perhaps an hour. Maybe longer. I lost track of time while I was stuck. An hour was more than enough time for Henderson to have returned if he was planning to return at all." Benjamin kept this thought to himself, not wanting to alarm Margaret further, but his estimation of the guide dropped considerably. No responsible man left a woman alone in such dangerous terrain, and no decent man failed to return when rockslides could happen without warning. "Can you travel?" he asked. Margaret tried to put weight on her injured ankle and immediately cried out in pain. "I do not think I can walk very far." "Then I will carry you." Before she could protest, Benjamin scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. Margaret instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her face flushing at the intimate contact. She could feel the solid mass of muscle beneath his buckskin shirt, could smell the clean scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. Up close, she could see that his face, though rugged and weathered from years in the sun, was handsome in a raw, unrefined way. His jaw was strong and covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, and his eyes, a striking shade of gray like storm clouds, held an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have a camp not far from here," Benjamin said, beginning the trek back along the trail. "It is closer than Pinyon. I can tend to your injuries there, and tomorrow we will make the journey to town if you are strong enough. It is not safe to travel these trails in the dark, even for someone who knows them as well as I do." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she needed to reach town immediately, but the pain in her ankle and ribs made the decision for her. Besides, there was something reassuring about this strange mountain man who had appeared out of nowhere and performed what seemed like a miracle. She let her head rest against his broad shoulder, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same. I do not think anyone else could have done the same. Those rocks, they must have weighed more than several men combined." Benjamin said nothing to this, his expression unreadable as he navigated the trail with steady, sure steps. The truth was, he did not fully understand his own strength. He had always been large, even as a boy, but since coming to the mountains, since dedicating himself to this harsh way of life, his body had developed beyond what seemed normal. He could do things that should have been impossible, and he had learned long ago not to draw attention to this fact. People feared what they could not explain, but Margaret did not look at him with fear. When her eyes had met his after he pulled her free, he had seen wonder there and gratitude, but not fear. Something about that look had stirred something deep within him that had been dormant for years. The journey to his camp took the better part of an hour, even with Benjamin's long strides. He barely seemed winded by the time they arrived at a small clearing nestled against the mountainside, protected from the worst of the wind by a natural rock formation. A simple but well-constructed cabin stood in the center of the clearing, built from pine logs and chinked with mud and moss. Nearby, a cold stream tumbled down from higher elevations, providing fresh water year-round. Benjamin carried Margaret inside and laid her carefully on his bed, which was little more than a wooden frame strung with rope and covered with thick furs and blankets. The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, a few shelves holding supplies, and various tools and pelts hanging from the walls. "I am going to examine your injuries properly now," Benjamin said, lighting a lantern to provide better illumination. "I apologize for any impropriety, but your health is more important than convention at the moment." Margaret nodded, her face pale. The adrenaline that had kept her alert during the rescue was fading, leaving her acutely aware of every ache and pain. Benjamin worked with efficient gentleness, carefully checking her ribs through her torn dress. His hands were warm and steady, and Margaret found herself trusting him implicitly despite having known him for less than 2 hours. "2 ribs are definitely bruised, possibly cracked," he announced. "I am going to wrap them. It will hurt at first, but the support will help you heal." He retrieved strips of clean cloth from a chest and began binding her rib cage. Margaret bit her lip against the pain, determined not to cry out. When he moved to her ankle, she watched his face as he worked. There was a focused intensity to his expression, a concentration that spoke of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "You have done this before," she observed. I have lived alone in these mountains for 5 years. You learn to tend your own injuries, or you do not survive. Why do you live alone? If you do not mind my asking. Benjamin hesitated, his hand stilling for a moment on the bandage he was wrapping around her ankle. That is a long story. I do not think I am going anywhere soon, Margaret said with a weak smile. Despite himself, Benjamin felt the corner of his mouth twitch. I suppose not. He secured the bandage and sat back on his heels. I came west from Missouri after my family died. Yellow fever took most of them in the span of 2 weeks. My mother, my father, my younger sister. I was the only one who survived. I am so sorry, Margaret said softly. After that, I could not stay. Everything in that town reminded me of what I had lost. So I packed what little I owned and headed west. I worked various jobs, mining, logging, ranch work, but I never felt settled. The towns were too crowded, too full of noise and people who wanted things from me. Then I found these mountains and I knew I was home. Margaret studied him with those keen green eyes. Do you never get lonely? Sometimes, Benjamin admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. But loneliness is preferable to the pain of losing people you love. If you do not let anyone close, they cannot be taken from you. That sounds like a very isolated way to live. It is the only way I know anymore. They fell silent, and Benjamin rose to prepare some food. He had fresh venison, which he sliced thin and roasted over the fire, along with some wild onions and tubers he had dug that morning. Margaret watched him move around the small cabin, noting the casual strength in every gesture. He was completely comfortable in this environment, utterly self-sufficient in a way that few men could claim to be. "What about you?" Benjamin asked as he handed her a tin plate of food. "What brings you to New Mexico territory?" Margaret accepted the plate gratefully, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. "I am traveling to California. My brother moved there 2 years ago and has established a successful business. He sent for me to come help him run it. That is a long journey for a woman alone. I am not alone. Or rather, I was not supposed to be. I hired Mr. Henderson in Santa Fe to guide me through this part of the territory. Obviously, that decision proved to be less wise than I hoped." "Henderson is known in these parts," Benjamin said, his tone carefully neutral. "His reputation is not sterling." "I am beginning to understand why," Margaret said dryly. "Do you think he will come back? Honestly?" "No. If he has not returned by now, he has likely continued on to wherever he was headed next, minus one client." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. "Then how will I reach California?" "I have some money, but not enough to hire another guide all the way from Pinon." "We will figure something out," Benjamin said. "First, you need to heal." Over the next several days, Margaret remained in Benjamin's cabin, recovering from her injuries. He gave her his bed and slept on the floor near the fire, insisting that her comfort was paramount. During the daylight hours, he would venture out to hunt and check his trap lines, always returning before dark with food or supplies. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, their conversations ranging from the practical to the philosophical. Margaret learned that Benjamin was far more educated than his rough exterior suggested. He had attended school through the 8th grade, unusual for someone from his background, and his mother had been a schoolteacher who insisted her children read extensively. He could quote Shakespeare and Byron from memory, though he claimed to have forgotten most of it. "The mind needs exercise just like the body," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "After I came to the mountains, I found I missed books. So whenever I go into town for supplies, I trade for any books I can find. I must have read some of them a dozen times by now." "What is your favorite?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Benjamin thought for a moment. There is a collection of Wordsworth's poetry that I found in an abandoned cabin 2 years ago. Something about his descriptions of nature speaks to me." Margaret smiled. "I would not have guessed you for a poetry reader." "Why?" "Because I live in the wilderness and move boulders with my bare hands." There was a hint of amusement in his tone. "I apologize. That was presumptuous of me. It is all right. Most people make assumptions based on appearances." "I have learned not to take offense." As the days passed, Margaret found herself drawn to Benjamin in ways that surprised her. She had known men before, had even been courted by a banker's son back in Ohio, but none of them had affected her the way this rugged mountain man did. There was a quiet strength to him that went beyond the physical, a depth of character that revealed itself in small moments. The way he carefully tended the fire each night to ensure she stayed warm, the gentleness with which he changed her bandages, the respect he showed her, never once taking advantage of their isolated situation despite the impropriety of it all. For his part, Benjamin was equally affected by Margaret's presence, though he tried desperately to deny it to himself. She had disrupted the careful solitude he had built, brought light and warmth into his lonely existence. Her laughter, when her ribs did not hurt too much, was like music. Her intelligence challenged him in ways he had forgotten he could be challenged. And her beauty, even bruised and battered as she had been, took his breath away. On the 5th day of her stay, Margaret insisted on getting up and moving around despite Benjamin's protests. Her ankle was much improved, and while her ribs still ached, she could breathe without sharp pain. She limped to the door of the cabin and stood looking out at the vast wilderness that stretched in every direction. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. "Harsh, but beautiful." Benjamin came to stand beside her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "It grows on you." The silence, the solitude, the way every day is a challenge to be met and overcome. "You think you will ever return to civilization?" "I do not know. This has been my home for so long now. The thought of going back to crowded streets and social niceties feels foreign." Margaret turned to look up at him. "But surely you must want more than this. A family, children, someone to share your life with." Benjamin met her gaze, and in his storm-gray eyes she saw a flicker of something that made her heart race. "I thought I had put away such wants. They seemed impossible, dreams for a different man in a different life. And now," he raised one calloused hand and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Now I am not so certain." Margaret leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. When Benjamin bent his head and kissed her, it was with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. His lips were soft against hers, questioning rather than demanding. She responded by rising on her toes and wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, and Margaret felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Every nerve in her body seemed to come alive, responding to his nearness, his taste, the feel of his strong arms encircling her waist. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Margaret," Benjamin said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have no right to do this. You are a lady and you have a life waiting for you in California. I am just a man who lives in the mountains with nothing to offer but these 2 hands and this simple cabin." "These 2 hands saved my life," Margaret reminded him. "And this simple cabin has been more of a home to me these past few days than anywhere I have been in years." "You say that now, but when you are healed and back in civilization, you will remember what you are giving up if you choose to stay here." "Let me be the judge of what I am willing to give up," Margaret said firmly. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Benjamin, I do not understand what is happening between us. We barely know each other. By all rights, I should be eager to leave and continue my journey, but the thought of leaving you fills me with a pain worse than any injury I sustained in that rockslide." Benjamin closed his eyes and pressed his forehead against hers. "I feel the same. From the moment I pulled you from those rocks, something changed in me. It was as if a part of my heart that had been frozen for 5 years suddenly thawed." They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the vast wilderness stretching out before them. Then Benjamin gently led her back inside, mindful of her still healing injuries. That evening they talked long into the night, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Margaret spoke of her childhood in Ohio, of the father who had died when she was young and the mother who had remarried a man Margaret could never bring herself to love. She told him about her brother's letters from California, full of descriptions of opportunity and promise, and how she had saved every penny for 2 years to afford the journey west. Benjamin shared more about his family, about the sister who had been only 16 when the fever took her, about the dreams he had once harbored of becoming a doctor before tragedy rerouted his life entirely. He spoke of his early days in the mountains, the mistakes he had made learning to survive, the close calls with weather and wild animals, and his own inexperience. "I nearly died that first winter," he admitted. "I had not prepared properly, had not gathered enough food or firewood. There was a blizzard that lasted for 5 days. I was trapped in a cave with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single blanket. When it was over, I swore I would never be unprepared again." "Yet you are still here," Margaret said, "despite the hardships." "Despite the hardships," Benjamin agreed. "Or perhaps because of them. There is something clarifying about living so close to the edge. Every day means something when you have to earn it." As the days turned into a week and then 2, Margaret's injuries continued to heal, but she made no move to discuss leaving. Benjamin did not bring it up either. They had fallen into a comfortable routine, working together to maintain the camp, prepare meals, and tend to the daily tasks that survival required. Margaret proved to be quick to learn and resilient despite her upbringing. She could clean fish without flinching, could start a fire with flint and steel after only a few demonstrations, could even shoot Benjamin's rifle with surprising accuracy once her ribs healed enough to handle the recoil. "You are a natural," Benjamin said with admiration as Margaret hit a target he had set up 70 yards away. "My father taught me to shoot when I was young," Margaret explained. "He said every person should know how to defend themselves and put food on the table, regardless of gender." "Your father was a wise man." One afternoon, as they sat by the stream cleaning some trout Benjamin had caught, Margaret finally broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "I should make a decision about California," she said quietly. "My brother will be worried if I do not arrive soon." Benjamin's hand stilled on the fish he was scaling. "You should write to him. Let him know you are safe. I can take a letter to Pinyon the next time I go for supplies. And tell him what exactly?" "That I have decided to abandon my plans and live in the mountains with a man I have known for only a few weeks." "Is that what you have decided?" Benjamin asked, his tone carefully neutral though his heart was pounding. Margaret set down her knife and turned to face him fully. "I do not know. Benjamin, I care for you deeply. What I feel when I am with you is unlike anything I have experienced before, but I am not naive. I know that living out here permanently would be vastly different from these few weeks of recovery. Winter will come, and with it true hardship. There will be isolation, danger, and a lack of the comforts I have known all my life." "All true," Benjamin acknowledged. "I would never lie to you about the realities of this life. But there is something else," Margaret continued. "Something I need to know before I can make any decision. Do you love me, Benjamin? Is this more to you than just companionship after years of solitude?" Benjamin set aside the fish and moved to kneel in front of her, taking her hands in his much larger ones. "Margaret, I have been trying not to love you. Trying to protect both of us from the pain I know love can bring. But I failed. I love you completely, utterly, with every part of me that knows how to love. You have brought life back into a heart I thought was dead. The thought of you leaving is agony, but I will not trap you here if this is not what you truly want. You deserve every opportunity, every comfort, every joy that life can offer, and I am not certain I can provide those things." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "You foolish, wonderful man. Do you not see? You already provide everything that matters. You make me feel safe. You challenge me to be stronger than I knew I could be. You look at me as if I am the most precious thing in the world. What are material comforts compared to that?" She leaned forward and kissed him, putting all her emotion into the gesture. Benjamin responded with equal passion, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her close. When they parted, both were smiling. "So you will stay?" Benjamin asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I will stay," Margaret confirmed, "but I do want to write to my brother. He deserves to know that I am well and have chosen a different path, and perhaps someday he could come visit. I would like you to meet him." "I would like that too," Benjamin said. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise of the life they would build together. The next day, Benjamin made the journey to Pinyon to post Margaret's letter and purchase some additional supplies. He was gone from dawn until well after dark, and Margaret spent the day organizing the cabin and planning improvements they could make. When Benjamin returned, he was carrying not just supplies but also a small wooden box, which he presented to her with uncharacteristic shyness. "What is this?" Margaret asked, accepting the box. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a simple gold ring. It was not fancy, not adorned with jewels or elaborate engravings, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "Margaret Dalton," Benjamin said, taking the ring and dropping to one knee. "I know we have not known each other long by conventional standards. I know I can offer you only a simple life in these mountains. But I love you with everything I am, and I will spend every day of my life ensuring you never regret choosing to stay. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." Benjamin slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. He stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in a circle that made them both laugh with pure joy. When he set her down, she grabbed his face and kissed him soundly. "When?" she asked breathlessly. "As soon as we can arrange it. There is a minister in Pinyon who makes a circuit through the territory. He is due back in town in 2 weeks. We could be married then." 2 weeks, Margaret repeated, her smile widening. "That seems like forever and no time at all." Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Benjamin worked tirelessly to improve the cabin, adding a second room, reinforcing the roof, building proper furniture to replace the rough pieces he had cobbled together for his solitary life. Margaret sewed new curtains from fabric Benjamin had bought in town, organized their supplies with impressive efficiency, and transformed the stark cabin into something that genuinely felt like a home. They talked late into every night, learning even more about each other, making plans for their future. Margaret wanted to plant a garden in the spring. Benjamin thought they might try raising a few chickens for eggs. They discussed the possibility of building a larger cabin eventually, one that could accommodate the children they both hoped to have. The night before they were to leave for Pinyon and their wedding, they sat outside beneath a canopy of stars, unlike anything Margaret had ever seen in more populated areas. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, and shooting stars periodically traced brief arcs across the darkness. "Are you nervous?" Benjamin asked, his arm around Margaret's shoulders as she leaned against his side. "About marrying you?" "Not at all," Margaret said. "About becoming a mountain wife with no experience in this kind of life." Terrified, Benjamin chuckled. "You have already proven yourself more capable than most men I have known. You will do just fine." "I hope you still think so when I burn our dinner for the 10th time or accidentally leave the door open and let some animal into our food stores." "Then we will eat burned food and hunt more game," Benjamin said simply. "Margaret, we are partners in this. Your mistakes will be my mistakes, and we will face them together." Margaret tilted her head up to look at him. "How did I get so lucky? To be trapped under those rocks on the exact day you happen to be hunting in that area. What are the odds?" "I have thought about that," Benjamin admitted. "If I had taken a different trail that morning, if I had tracked that deer to the east instead of losing it to the west, if I had been an hour earlier or later, I never would have heard you scream. It feels like fate." "You believe in fate." "I never used to. But I am finding it hard to explain our meeting any other way." They kissed under the stars, and Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. This was where she was meant to be. This man was who she was meant to find. The journey to Pinyon the next morning took several hours, even with Margaret riding the horse Benjamin kept for his rare trips to town. She was still not comfortable with long periods of walking on her ankle, though it had healed remarkably well. Benjamin walked alongside the horse, his long strides easily keeping pace. Pinyon was a small town, barely more than a collection of adobe buildings and wooden storefronts clustered around a central plaza. The church was the most substantial structure, built of adobe and whitewashed, with a small bell tower that rose above the surrounding buildings. The minister, Reverend Thomas Hayes, was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. He asked them only a few questions before agreeing to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. "Life in the territories is hard enough," he said warmly. "When people find love and companionship, I see no reason to delay their union." Benjamin had no family to attend, and Margaret's were all far away, but several townspeople came to witness the ceremony once word spread that the mysterious mountain man who occasionally appeared in town was getting married. There was speculation and gossip, of course, but Margaret held her head high and ignored the whispers. She wore a simple blue dress that Benjamin had purchased for her, and she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers they had picked on the way to town. When the Reverend asked Benjamin to repeat his vows, his deep voice rang clear and strong in the small church. "I, Benjamin Zeller, take you, Margaret Dalton, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by your side in times of joy and hardship. I give you my whole heart from this day until my last day." Margaret's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she spoke her own vows. "I, Margaret Dalton, take you, Benjamin Zeller, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and build a life with you in these mountains. I give you my whole heart from this day until my last day." When Reverend Hayes pronounced them husband and wife and Benjamin kissed his bride, the small congregation erupted in applause. Margaret felt tears of happiness streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. They spent their wedding night in Pinyon's only boarding house, a luxury that Benjamin insisted upon despite the expense. It was the first time they had been truly alone with no barriers of propriety between them, and they approached each other with a mixture of passion and tenderness that spoke to the depth of their connection. Benjamin was gentle and patient, mindful of Margaret's still healing injuries, and she responded with a fervor that surprised them both. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Margaret traced the scars that marked Benjamin's chest and arms, remnants of his years surviving in the wilderness. "Tell me the story of this one," she said, touching a long scar that ran along his ribs. "A mountain lion took exception to me checking a trap near her den. She got in one good swipe before I convinced her to leave. And this one," Margaret touched a circular scar on his shoulder, "that is from a foolish decision to climb a cliff face in winter. The rock was more icy than I realized, and I fell about 20 feet, landed on a branch that went clean through." Margaret shuddered. "You could have died." "Many times over," Benjamin agreed, "but I am still here, and now I have a reason beyond mere survival to keep myself safe." Margaret kissed the scars one by one as if she could heal the old wounds with her affection. "I love you, Benjamin Zeller. I love you, Margaret Zeller." The name made Margaret smile. Margaret Zeller. It sounded strong, capable, like the woman she was becoming. They returned to the mountain the next day, eager to begin their life together in earnest. The summer faded into autumn, and the mountain transformed into a riot of gold and red as the aspen leaves turned. Margaret learned to preserve food for winter, to smoke meat and dry fruits, to store root vegetables in the cold cellar Benjamin dug beneath the cabin. She learned to read the weather signs, to know when a storm was coming by the behavior of the animals and the feel of the air. Benjamin taught her to track game, to identify edible plants, to navigate by the stars. He showed her the secret places in the mountains, the hidden meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion come spring, the hot springs where they could bathe in comfort even as snow fell around them, the caves that provided shelter in the worst weather. Margaret, in turn, brought her own knowledge to their partnership. She was better with numbers than Benjamin, and she helped him calculate more accurate measurements for his building projects. Her education had included some basic medicine, and she created a better organized system for their medical supplies and herbal remedies. She taught Benjamin songs her mother had taught her, filling their cabin with music during the long evenings. Winter arrived in November with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled higher than Margaret had ever imagined possible. There were days when they could not leave the cabin, when the world outside was nothing but white emptiness and howling wind. But inside, they were warm and safe and content. They talked. They read aloud to each other from Benjamin's small collection of books. They made love and they dreamed of the future. "You ever regret it?" Benjamin asked one night as they lay in bed, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Giving up California, giving up the chance for an easier life." Margaret propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Not for a single moment. Benjamin, I have everything I need right here. Yes, this life is harder than what I knew before. Yes, there are challenges I never imagined I would face, but I am happier than I have ever been. I wake up every morning excited for the day ahead, even if that day involves nothing more than mending clothes or chopping wood, because I am sharing it with you." Benjamin pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "You are extraordinary. You know that, do not you?" "I am ordinary," Margaret corrected. "I am just an ordinary woman who happened to fall in love with an extraordinary man who moves boulders with his bare hands." As winter deepened, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The realization came gradually, her monthly cycle failing to appear, morning nausea that made their simple breakfasts almost impossible to eat, a tenderness in her breasts that had nothing to do with Benjamin's touch. When she finally told him, he was overcome with emotion, pulling her into his arms and holding her as if she might disappear. "We are going to have a baby," he whispered, his voice thick. "A child, our child. Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could see the joy written plainly on his face. Happy does not begin to cover it, Benjamin said. I never thought I would have this, a family of my own. I thought that chance died with my first family back in Missouri. Well, you have it now, Margaret said, smiling through her own tears. Come summer, we are going to be parents. The rest of winter passed in a glow of anticipation despite the harsh conditions. Benjamin became even more protective of Margaret, if such a thing were possible, insisting she avoid any task that might be too strenuous. Margaret, for her part, chafed at the restrictions, but understood they came from love rather than a desire to control her. They spent hours discussing names, preparing a cradle that Benjamin carved with exquisite care, and planning how they would manage with an infant in their remote home. Margaret sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her heart swelling with love for the child she had not yet met. I hope he has your strength, Margaret said one evening, her hand resting on her still flat belly. I hope he has your courage, Benjamin countered, and your intelligence and your kind heart. What if it is a girl? Then I hope she has all those things and more. I hope she grows up knowing she can do anything, be anything, because her parents will support her no matter what. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it did so with spectacular beauty. The snow melted to reveal meadows carpeted with wildflowers, and the streams ran high with runoff. Animals emerged from their winter dens, and the hunting improved dramatically. Margaret's belly grew round and prominent, and she marveled at the feeling of the baby moving inside her. In late May, her labor began. Benjamin had been preparing for this moment for months, studying every bit of information he could find about childbirth, gathering supplies, making contingency plans. But when the moment actually arrived, he found himself nearly paralyzed with fear. Benjamin, Margaret said firmly, gripping his hand as a contraction passed. I need you to be strong right now. I need you to be the man who moved boulders to save my life. Can you do that for me? Her words snapped him back to focus. He nodded, squeezing her hand. I can do that. Tell me what you need. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Benjamin stayed by Margaret's side every moment, supporting her, encouraging her, wiping her brow with cool water when the pain became almost unbearable. He marveled at her strength, at the way she faced this primal struggle with the same courage she had shown when trapped under tons of rock. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the mountains. Benjamin caught him with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face as he carefully cleaned the infant and wrapped him in soft cloth before placing him in Margaret's waiting arms. He is perfect, Margaret whispered, gazing down at the tiny face. Absolutely perfect. Just like his mother, Benjamin said, kissing her forehead. You were incredible. I am in awe of you. They named him Daniel after Margaret's father and Thomas after the minister who had married them. Little Daniel Zeller had his mother's green eyes and a shock of dark hair that suggested he might favor his father in coloring. He was healthy and strong, and from his first days, it was clear he had inherited Benjamin's robust constitution. The summer after Daniel's birth was one of the happiest periods of either of their lives. They adjusted to parenthood with the same teamwork that had characterized their marriage from the beginning. Benjamin proved to be a devoted father, fashioning a sling that allowed him to carry Daniel on his chest while he worked, talking to the baby constantly about everything he was doing. Margaret loved watching them together, her heart overflowing with love for both of them. He is going to grow up wild and free, she said one afternoon, watching Benjamin show their son a butterfly that had landed on his finger. Daniel was too young to focus on it properly, but he seemed fascinated by his father's voice. Is that acceptable to you? Benjamin asked. It is perfect, Margaret said. He will know how to survive, how to read the land and the sky, but he will also know books and learning because we will teach him. He will have the best of both worlds." As Daniel grew from an infant into a toddler, he displayed early signs of his father's remarkable strength. By the time he was 2, he could lift rocks that most children twice his age would struggle with. Benjamin watched this development with mixed feelings, remembering his own childhood and the way his unusual strength had sometimes made him feel isolated. "We will teach him to use his gifts wisely," Margaret said when Benjamin voiced his concerns. "To understand that strength is not just about physical power, but about character and compassion." "You are right," Benjamin agreed, "and he has you as an example. You are the strongest person I know, and you have never lifted anything heavier than a water bucket." Margaret laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Zeller." When Daniel was 3 years old, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less surprised by the symptoms, and she announced the news to Benjamin with quiet joy. "Another one," he said, placing his hand on her belly. "Our family is growing. Are you happy?" "I am beyond happy. I am blessed beyond measure." Their second child, a daughter they named Lily Rose, arrived on a crisp October morning when the aspens were at peak color. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's delicate features, and she was the most beautiful thing Margaret had ever seen. Daniel, now 3.5, was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to touch her tiny hands and watch her sleep. "Gentle," Benjamin reminded him repeatedly. "She is very small and fragile." "I protect her," Daniel announced seriously, "like Papa protects us." Benjamin met Margaret's eyes over their children's heads, and they shared a smile of perfect understanding and contentment. The years flowed by like the streams that ran through their mountain home, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. Daniel grew into a strong, capable boy who could track a deer through the forest and solve complex arithmetic problems with equal ease. Lily proved to be more delicate in constitution than her brother, but she had a quick mind and a creative spirit that expressed itself in drawings and stories she would dictate to her mother. When Daniel was 8 and Lily was almost 5, Margaret became pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder on her body than the previous 2 had been, and Benjamin worried constantly. He tried to get her to rest more, to let him handle a greater share of the work, but Margaret insisted on maintaining her routines. "I am not made of glass," she said firmly when Benjamin protested her hauling water from the stream. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while still managing their daily tasks." "Not my wife," Benjamin said, taking the bucket from her hands. "My wife has a husband who can carry water and do any other task that needs doing. Your job is to grow our child and stay healthy." Their third child, another son they named Jacob William, arrived in early spring. He was smaller than Daniel had been but perfectly healthy, with a calm temperament that was immediately apparent. Where Daniel had been a fussy baby, demanding constant attention, Jacob was content to lie in his cradle and observe the world with solemn eyes. Margaret's brother finally made the journey from California to visit when Jacob was 6 months old. William Dalton arrived with his wife Sarah and their own 2 children, eager to finally meet the man his sister had chosen over continuing her journey west. The visit was a resounding success. William, a pragmatic businessman, was initially skeptical of Benjamin's lifestyle, but as the days passed and he saw how capable and content his sister was, how strong and healthy his niece and nephews were, his doubts melted away. "I thought you had lost your mind," William admitted to Margaret one evening while they sat outside watching their children play together. "Giving up everything to live in these mountains with a man you barely knew, But I was wrong. You have built something remarkable here." "I found what I was meant to find," Margaret said simply. "If I had continued to California, I would have had comfort and society and all the things I thought I wanted. But I would not have had Benjamin. I would not have had this life, and I cannot imagine anything better." William turned to look at his brother-in-law, who was teaching Daniel and William's own son how to identify animal tracks. "He is a good man. Unusual, but good." "He is the best man I have ever known," Margaret said. "He saved my life in more ways than one." The visit lasted 2 weeks, and when William and his family departed, there were promises to visit again and invitations for Benjamin and Margaret to bring their children to California someday. As they waved goodbye, watching the wagon disappear down the mountain trail, Benjamin put his arm around Margaret's waist. "That went well," he said. "Better than well," Margaret agreed. "William approves, which I did not realize I needed until I had it." "Your opinion is the only one that matters to me," Benjamin said, "but I am glad your brother could see that you are happy." "I am more than happy," Margaret said, leaning into his embrace. "I am complete." The children continued to grow, each developing their own personalities and strengths. Daniel proved to have inherited not just his father's physical power, but also his deep connection to the wilderness. By the time he was 12, he was already a skilled hunter and tracker, capable of surviving on his own for days at a time. He was serious and thoughtful, with a protective streak toward his siblings that made Benjamin proud. Lily, at 9, was their dreamer. She had learned to read at an early age and consumed every book they owned multiple times. She wrote stories and poems, created elaborate drawings of fantastical creatures, and seemed to exist partially in a world of her own imagination. Yet she was also surprisingly practical when needed, helping her mother with household tasks and tending the garden they had expanded over the years. Jacob, the youngest at 7, was their peacemaker. He had a gift for reading emotions and soothing conflicts between his siblings. He was equally comfortable in the wilderness or the cabin, adapting easily to whatever was required of him. He adored both his parents and sought to please them in everything he did. One autumn afternoon, when Daniel was 14, he asked to speak with his father privately. They walked together through the forest, and Benjamin waited patiently for his son to gather his thoughts. "Papa," Daniel finally said, "I have been thinking about something, about who I am and what I can do." Benjamin's heart sank. He had been waiting for this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. "Your strength." "Yes, I can do things, Papa, things that other people cannot do. I have heard the stories from when we go into town, about how you moved boulders with your bare hands to save Mama. I think I have that same ability." "You do," Benjamin confirmed. "I have watched you develop it over the years." "But why? Why are we like this?" Benjamin sighed. "I do not have a complete answer for you, Daniel. I have wondered the same thing my entire life. All I know is that our family seems to be stronger than most. Perhaps it is something in our blood, something passed down through generations. My own father was unusually strong, though not to the degree you and I are. I suspect it has been building, growing stronger with each generation." "Does it make us freaks?" Daniel asked quietly. Benjamin stopped walking and turned to face his son, placing both hands on his shoulders. "Listen to me. Our strength does not define us. It is simply one part of who we are. What matters is how we choose to use it. I used mine to save your mother's life. You can use yours for good or ill, to help or to harm. The choice will always be yours." "I want to use it to help," Daniel said firmly. "Like you did." "Then you are already a better man than most," Benjamin said. "I am proud of you, son." That winter was particularly harsh, with storms that buried their cabin in snow up to the eaves. They were prepared, as they always were, with stores of food and firewood that would see them through until spring. But the isolation was more complete than usual, with weeks passing between clear days when they could venture outside. It was during one of those long, snowbound weeks that Margaret and Benjamin talked late into the night while their children slept, reflecting on the life they had built together. "You ever think about that day?" Margaret asked, her head resting on Benjamin's chest as they lay in bed. "The day of the Rockslide. Every day of my life," Benjamin admitted. "I think about how close I came to never finding you, about all the chances that had to align perfectly for me to be in that exact place at that exact time. I think about it too. About how terrified I was, trapped under those rocks, certain I was going to die there. And then I heard your voice, and somehow I knew I would be all right." "I was terrified too," Benjamin confessed. "When I saw you trapped there, when I realized how much stone was pinning you down, I was terrified I would not be strong enough, that I would fail and have to watch you die." Margaret raised her head to look at him. "But you did not fail. You moved mountains for me, literally and figuratively. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible." "You gave me the same," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "Before you, I was just existing, surviving but not truly living. You brought me back to life." They kissed, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of years of love and intimacy and shared struggle. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell. But inside, they were warm and safe and profoundly grateful for everything they had found in each other. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it came the inevitable changes that life brings. Daniel, at 15, began talking about eventually wanting to explore more of the world, to see what lay beyond their mountain home. Benjamin and Margaret encouraged this, knowing that their son needed to make his own path, even if it led away from them. Lily, at 12, announced that she wanted to be a teacher someday. She had been teaching Jacob his letters and numbers for years, and she discovered she loved the process of helping someone else learn and grow. Margaret supported this dream wholeheartedly, beginning to teach Lily more formal pedagogical methods. Jacob, at 10, seemed content to simply be wherever his family was. He helped his father with the heavy work around their property, learning the skills he would need to survive in the wilderness. He listened to his sister's stories with rapt attention, and followed his brother like a shadow when Daniel would allow it. When Daniel turned 16, he asked for permission to make a solo journey to Pinyon and the surrounding area. He wanted to test himself, to see if he could handle the challenges of the wider world. Benjamin understood the impulse completely, having felt that same need for independence at his son's age. "Go," he said, clasping Daniel's shoulder. "Explore, learn, discover who you are beyond this mountain. But know that you always have a home here, always have a family that loves you." Daniel's eyes were suspiciously bright as he embraced his father. "Thank you, Papa. I will make you proud. You already have, son, every single day." Daniel's departure left a hole in the family's daily routine, but letters arrived regularly, brought by trappers and traders who passed through Pinyon. He wrote of the people he met, the things he saw, the work he found helping with construction projects where his remarkable strength made him invaluable. He was building a reputation, he wrote, as the strongest man in New Mexico territory. "He sounds happy," Margaret said, reading one of his letters aloud to the family one evening. "He does," Benjamin agreed. "But he also sounds like he is figuring out that strength alone does not bring satisfaction. He needs purpose, direction." "He will find it," Margaret said confidently. "He has the best teacher. He learned from watching you." 2 years later, Daniel returned home with a surprise. He brought with him a young woman named Elizabeth, a schoolteacher's daughter he had met in Santa Fe. She was sweet-faced and intelligent, with a quick laugh and an obvious deep affection for Daniel. The family welcomed her warmly, and within a few months, Daniel and Elizabeth were married in the same church in Pinyon, where Benjamin and Margaret had exchanged their own vows. They built their own cabin on a piece of land about a mile from Benjamin and Margaret's home, close enough to be part of the family but far enough for independence. Elizabeth adapted to mountain life with surprising ease, and she and Margaret became close friends as well as family. When Daniel and Elizabeth's first child was born, a son they named Benjamin after his grandfather, Margaret held her grandson and wept with joy. "We are grandparents," she said wonderingly to Benjamin. "How did that happen? I feel as if we were just starting our own life together." 20 years have passed," Benjamin said, looking down at the baby in his wife's arms. 20 years since I pulled you from under those rocks. 20 years of the best life I could have imagined." "Only 20 years," Margaret teased gently. "It feels like we have been together forever." "And I hope we have forever more ahead of us," Benjamin said. Lily, true to her dreams, eventually did become a teacher. She divided her time between their mountain home and Pinyon, where she taught children whose families could not afford to send them away to school. She never married, claiming she was too busy and too content with her life to need a husband, though there were several men who courted her over the years. Jacob grew into a solid, dependable man who seemed born for mountain life. He eventually married a widow with 2 young children, bringing them all to live on the mountain and expanding the family's small community. He and his stepchildren took over much of the heavy work from Benjamin, who was now in his 50s and finally beginning to show his age. The years continued to pass, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The original cabin was expanded multiple times, and additional structures were built to accommodate the growing family. What had started as Benjamin's solitary refuge became a thriving homestead, proof that love and family could flourish even in the harshest environment. On a warm summer evening, when Benjamin was 62 and Margaret 58, they sat together on the porch they had added to the cabin years earlier. They could hear their grandchildren playing in the meadow, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Daniel and Elizabeth's home was visible in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney. Jacob's children were helping their mother prepare dinner in the cabin behind them. "We did well," Benjamin said, taking Margaret's hand in his. His hands were more gnarled now, marked by decades of hard work, but they were still strong. "We did more than well," Margaret corrected. "We built something beautiful, a life, a family, a legacy. All because you survived that rockslide. All because you refused to let me die," Margaret said. "All because you moved boulders with your bare hands and pulled me into your life." Benjamin raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Best decision I ever made." "Best decision we ever made," Margaret said. "I chose to stay, remember? I chose this life, this mountain, you. And I would choose it again, every single time." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together in comfortable silence. Around them, their family thrived, their legacy secured not just in the children and grandchildren they had raised but in the values they had instilled. Strength was important, but love was essential. Survival mattered, but so did joy. Independence was valuable, but family was priceless. Margaret rested her head on Benjamin's shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The mountain had tested them, shaped them, and ultimately blessed them beyond measure. "I love you," Benjamin said softly. "I love you too," Margaret replied. "Always and forever." The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding vows decades ago, the same stars that had shone down on every moment of joy and sorrow and triumph they had shared. The mountains stood eternal around them, silent witnesses to a love story that had begun with a rockslide and a desperate rescue, and had grown into something that would endure for generations. In the gathering darkness, surrounded by the sounds of family and the familiar landscape of their home, Benjamin and Margaret Zeller sat hand in hand, two hearts that had found each other against impossible odds and had built a life of profound meaning and deep contentment. The mountain man who had once lived in isolation had become a husband, father, and grandfather. The city woman who had been trapped and helpless had become a mountain wife of remarkable strength and resilience. Together, they had proven that love could move mountains, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, but always powerfully and completely. Their story was one of courage and faith, of taking chances and making commitments, of choosing love over comfort and family over convenience. As the night deepened and the family began moving inside for dinner, Benjamin helped Margaret to her feet. She moved more slowly now, her body bearing the marks of a life well lived, but her eyes still sparkled with the same intelligence and spirit that had first captured his heart. "Come," she said, taking his hand. "Our family is waiting." Benjamin followed her inside, into the warmth and light and laughter that filled every corner of the home they had built together. The door closed behind them, shutting out the darkness, keeping safe the love that had sustained them through decades of mountain living. And in the morning, when the sun rose again over the peaks and valleys of their beloved New Mexico mountains, they would rise with it, ready to face another day together, still in love, still grateful, still amazed at the life they had created from a single moment of crisis and a miraculous rescue so many years before.